May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, the gospel sounds pretty harsh today, doesn't it? Some of those sayings that they call hard sayings, which usually the first inclination of any preacher when you read that is to look at the other lessons and see if there's something you'd rather preach on from that. But I've always discovered that when I do pull one of those hard sayings, I can't get away from dealing with it. I always end up going back to it. And when I go back to the hard sayings of Jesus, I invariably find that they mean something different than I initially think they mean. And this is a good case in point, to look at what Jesus meant and what he didn't mean. For instance, when he tells the man to let the dead bury the dead, he's not suggesting that people go off and leave dead bodies in the street to follow him. In fact, these words aren't talking about someone whose father has died at all. Instead, they are a phrase directed to someone whose father has not died yet. You see, what the man is telling him is, yeah, it sounds pretty good, this idea of following you, but you know, I don't know how my dad will think about that, so when he's gone, when he's dead, then I'll come along. And to that, Jesus says, you know, it's not for later, it's for now. And when the young man, or maybe it was a woman, I can't remember now which, but when he or she says, I've got to first go back and say farewell to my family, Jesus isn't talking about not taking leave of the people that we care about. He's not talking about just going without telling anybody that you've left. No, this phrase is directed to someone who found the idea of following Jesus attractive, but felt that maybe it needed to wait till the children at home had grown up and gone their separate ways, and then maybe he would follow. And Jesus tells him, the time isn't later, the time is now. And that's the message, really, of these hard sayings, and I'm not sure they're easier than the first look at the gospel indicates. But the saying is that the time is now. Not later, but now. And although when Jesus first spoke these words, he may really have literally meant following him, as in leaving that town and going with him around the countryside. But when these words were written down by Luke some 40 years later, that wasn't really the situation in the church, so it couldn't have meant that. At the time Luke wrote these down, 40 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, there weren't that many itinerant preachers that left everything and just went around the countryside. Some people were called to that. But the words were written for specific Christian communities. And they were written for people who wanted to follow Jesus by committing themselves to one of these communities, church, if you will, a place where the focus was on following the way that Jesus had shown. And quite often in that time, this did indeed put them at odds with friends, with family, with their culture in general. Now, by that time, following didn't mean traipsing all over the country. Following meant following a particular way of life. And Jesus reminds them and reminds us as well this morning that to follow that way of life doesn't need to wait till later. It needs to begin now. Which I guess brings us to a question. To a question of what does following mean now? And Paul deals with that very question in the reading we read from the letter to the Galatians. To follow according to Paul is to live by the Spirit, he says. And to tell whether you are living by the Spirit or not, he says, look at what kind of fruit your life bears. He says that's a measure. That when you're living and letting yourself be led by the Spirit, your life bears one kind of fruit, and when you're not, it tends to bear a different kind of fruit. And so he gives us these long lists that were probably not original, not intended to be all-inclusive, but lists that probably circulated in the culture of his time, lists of those things that are not good ideas, to bear and those things that are good ideas to bear. And so he talks about those things that indicate our turning our back on the Spirit. Things like jealousy, things like quarrels, envy, all of those kinds of things, that attitudes and behavior that are not in the spirit of life, in the Spirit of God, in the Spirit of goodness. Things that we end up falling into when we let ourselves fall away from living in the Spirit. And on the other hand, he lifts up things that he calls fruits of the Spirit. Fruits such as love, joy, and gentleness. Things that when our life is being led by the Spirit of goodness, the Spirit of God, the Spirit of life, are fruits that we bear. But you know, quite so often, what we try to do is to bear those fruits without paying any attention to the Spirit. Now, if you think about it, if you think about the metaphor of fruit, real fruit, it doesn't just appear out of nowhere. I mean, contrary to what it looks like when you go to Kroger's and there are bins and bins and bins of 6 or 7 or 8 different kinds of apples that look like they just sort of appeared there. You know very well that at one point in time they had to grow. They grew from a tree. And you know that if a tree is diseased, or if it's not taken care of, if it's dying inside, it doesn't produce the kind of good fruit that magically appears in the bin. So if we stick with that metaphor for just a minute, then what we see is that our lives are the tree. We are the tree. And when we simply try to ignore the health of that tree, in body, in mind, and in spirit, when we pay no attention to it, do nothing to nurture it, and just try to grow the fruit, then the fruit comes out damaged. Love comes out not looking like love. Joy comes out not looking like joy. Kindness even comes out sometimes looking more like what we want to do for somebody than what they want or need for us to do in reality. Because if the tree isn't tended, the fruit doesn't come out at all, or it comes out damaged. The spiritual tree, which is our own lives, only bears good fruit when we tend the tree, when we tend the Spirit. Every major religion in the world, everyone speaks to this need, the need for tending the Spirit. And in every serious practice that leads to spiritual health, mental health, and physical health, there is always one word that appears time and time and time again: balance. Whatever the religion, whatever the spiritual practice, time and time again, it is said that what leads to the health of that tree, that spiritual life of our own, is balance. And that includes a care of body and mind, as well as spirit.